Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Mancini, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of the OxyMorons. And for those of you who are not familiar with the show, it's all about talking to people that I find interesting. And it was an outgrowth of COVID when we were all looking for interesting people to talk to. And the theme of the show is to talk to folks that are kind of this weird combination of both dreaming and pragmatism. So, the oxymorons are, I find, to be a relatively rare breed of character out in the marketplace. Usually people are either visionaries or pragmatists, but not both. So oxymorons are all about practical dreamers and visionary pragmatists. And we broadcast this live. You can find it on LinkedIn. For those of you that are watching on LinkedIn, you can also comment directly, or you can put those little clap hand things or hearts and all that kind of jazz that shows up on LinkedIn. And please feel free to do so. And if you comment, we'd love to post your questions or bring you up in during the context of the show. So let me introduce Rich Palarea. And truth be told, Rich and I go back a long way. We were just talking about how long that worked. We worked together at AIM many, many years ago. And so, Rich, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I really enjoyed just chatting kind of in the green room, so to speak, and catching up with you because it had been so long. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So it's really nice to be here. So when we worked together at AIM, you ran the IT department there. I remember we had this cool concept at one point that, IT people needed to work in a different context than everybody else. And we had this playroom with all sorts of like creative things all around and all that kind of stuff. But tell me, that's been a long time. Tell me what you've been up to since AIM.
Yeah, well, a whole lifetime of stuff, actually. I mean, when I left AIM was right around the time that we were contemplating selling the show. That was our biggest asset. And that was not an easy decision that you and the executive team had to make. And when you did that, we were also faced with the 9/11 situation that happened immediately thereafter. And we had that show scheduled at the Javits Center for, I think it was October, and September 11th happened. And nobody was traveling to New York. I don't think anybody was traveling to trade shows, period. They didn't want to fly. So we were really faced with that unprecedented time in the business. And you really led us well through all of that in the days that followed the attacks. You pulled us together, and that was really a hallmark. I left the organization shortly after that. We were going through some downsizing at the time, and I left because I had started another business at the time that was in transportation spend management. I was helping companies negotiate contracts to companies that use a lot of DHL, FedEx, UPS. And I started that for my wife back when we lived in California before we moved to DC, and kind of kept that running the whole time while we were having kids and just kind of in the background operating. And I said, John, I have a place to go, fire me. I'll leave. And because I had something that was, was making me a little bit of money. So I did that for quite a period of time. And then I wasn't looking to do anything else. Was happy with what I was doing. Yeah, it was somewhat fulfilling. I used a lot of technology to achieve things in a better, faster, smarter way. And it was a lifestyle business, putting some money in my family's bank account. But about 10 years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting two former medical device reps. These are guys who do orthopedic surgery in hospitals in and around the DC and Baltimore regions. And they wanted to start a business where they could go back into the hospital using all the knowledge that they had and help the hospitals negotiate better pricing on knee and hip implants, primarily knee and hip. And they've expanded to spine and cardiovascular and other areas since. And they told me this fantastic tale about how they stand as a salesperson. They stand in the operating room with the surgeon. They're not providing patient care. They're just selling devices, tendering them into the sterile field. And there's no price tag on the box, so the surgeon doesn't know what these things cost. And this is what really blew my mind about it, John. They tally everything on a piece of paper about what they sold during the surgery, and they write down the price. They get a nurse to sign it, and then they carry that piece of paper down the hallway to purchasing and turn it in to a non-clinical buyer, expecting to interpret this gobbledygook and scratched out things and pricing, and they expect to get a purchase order. And so My first reaction to this was really, if I'm being honest, oh my gosh, my mom had her hip done last week, and one of you jokers was standing in the op.
I had a hip at one point. They were probably there for that.
And then, I kind of went back home and thought about it a little bit and thought, I don't need to make my life any more complex. What am I going to do in healthcare? I mean, my dad was a cardiologist, but I never got close to the business side of how all this works. But the more I thought about it, the more it just was gnawing at me. And I called them back a couple of days later. I said, if you guys want to try it, let's set up a joint venture. I'll give you an office. I'll give you some software assets that I had built. I'll provide my leadership as the CEO, and we'll just see what happens. And pretty quickly, we landed 2 hospitals in one in Annapolis and one in Hagerstown in Maryland, and saved them $3 million and $5 million each.
Wow.
Took a portion of that savings as our fee and bankrolled the start of the business without having to take any investment money. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm not being a great CEO of 2 companies at once. I need to get out of one of these boats. They were both kind of drifting apart, and my legs were, my feet were on each one. So I sold the logistics business, and then we named this Kermit 10 years ago, and we've been doing it since 2011.
Cool name. Cool name. And tell me, acronyms are always a challenge for all of us in this space. PPI in the medical industry business. What does that stand for?
Yeah, this is very curious when you think about it. Physician preference items.
Oh, okay.
Why does the physician have a preference? Why do they get a preference? Should they not have a preference? These are all devices that they were trained on when they came out of school. They were fellowship trained. They came out of their residency, and they have a preference or a proclivity toward a certain set of instruments because they work well in their hands and they can get in and out of the operating room quickly and have a great outcome for the patient. But by and large, and we're just talking about knee and hip implants for a moment, they're all metal and plastic. They all work exactly the same. It doesn't matter what they're made out of. It doesn't matter their design. Yes, there are some nuances, but a lot of that is really just sales and technology features that, that the device manufacturers put on top of these things to charge more. When you get a hip done, you go in with pain, you come out walking. That's the objective. It doesn't matter if it's Stryker or Zimmer Biomet or Smith & Nephew, who's the implant manufacturer is. So it's this curious thing. And what Kermit is doing is it's going in and telling the surgeon, we're not going to change your preference. We're not going to take away your toys. We just want to make sure the price of that item is the same as its equivalent from the competitors all across. So a femoral component that goes into the femur on a hip, let's say it's $800 and they've got one at $1,200, one at $1,500, one at $700. We're going to level it all to the same place. And by doing that, we're letting them keep all their toys. We're not changing their practice, but we're ensuring the hospital honestly just remains solvent. 1 out of every 2 hospitals today, right now this year, are going to post an operating loss in the United States. So wow. It's a very significant undertaking.
It's really interesting that what you talk about this question of transparency of pricing in the hospital and healthcare business, and because I remember I got a hip replacement, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. I had no idea how much it cost. I had no idea any of the details of it. And then afterwards, in the context of some of the healthcare reform things, I remember attending a presentation where people talked about, a hip replacement might cost in any particular geographic area, like 40,000 one place, 75,000 one place, 100,000 one place. And that question of transparency just seems to be such an important element in basically keeping all the players aligned with the market, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And this has been a big push recently with CMS, the Centers for Medicare. What they're trying to do is they want to have payment reform. And we're sitting here where I am. I'm in the state of Maryland, and we have a very different payment model for how we reimburse hospitals. We have what's called a global budget. So at the beginning of the year, the hospital rate setting commission says, here's what we're going to reimburse for a hip. Go make it work. And it's a very practical way of doing it. It's how you would run a business, how I'd run a business. Let's look at profitability. Let's manage our own costs. And if we can do things better, faster, cheaper, and still at a great outcome, we get to save that. We call it profit. Doesn't work like that in a hospital. There's
Yep.
all this disparate pricing. And a lot of it for many years had been a fee for service model where if hospitals were at a deficit in their budget, they would just do more surgeries. And that was the top line revenue, always has been for hospitals. They lose a lot of money in other places. They lose money on every COVID patient that comes in. But their top line revenues were around these elective surgeries. And when the pandemic broke, that was the first thing that shut down were those operating rooms.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. So the pricing transparency, what's it going to cost for the patient? The bundled payment where Medicare says, we'll just give you one payment. You guys figure it out. You keep the savings. These are all movements toward, I think, where this value-based process is going inside of medicine. But it's very telling that for many, many years, we have not run hospitals like businesses. And that's the big push right now.
Yeah, it's funny being of a certain age now where I get the statements from Medicare. I'm always very intrigued at, like, the different, you pay this, somebody else pays that, here's the difference. I'm always thinking, like, who's paying for that? And it just it's always been, like, very confusing. I remember my mom at one point, I was handling some of her financial stuff, and I was getting bills from a bunch of people, and I said, well, Ma, should I be paying these? It says, no, just let them stay for 2 or 3 times and let the system sort out ultimately the paperwork associated with who pays what. I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting business model.
It's the wisdom of a parent. I mean, they're full of that kind of stuff, right?
Well, tell me, let's say, so Kermit is KermitPPI.com. Is that the website?
That's correct. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And when I was looking at it, I was intrigued by the tagline on there, which was collaboration, compliance, and analytics.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about that combo and kind of how you manifest that in terms of the value that you deliver to the marketplace.
Sure. So I mentioned this paper-based billing process that goes on. So one part of our business is we understand where the prices ought to be in the market. We've negotiated hundreds of these contracts over the past 10, 11 years. And we kind of, we know basically where the market kind of squeaks a little bit when you've taken a little too far and you back off. That's kind of the prevailing price. So we help them negotiate better prices. They outsource that to us. We do all the heavy lifting of that. But we also take this paper-based billing process and we digitize that. We've created a piece of software, lives in the cloud, that the reps for the salespeople for the implant companies use a mobile device. We give them an app and they document everything they've sold. And when they hit submit, it goes to the cloud. And what Kermit, the software, is doing is it's adjudicating that bill in real time, correcting the price overages, looking for wasted items. How can you have 2 kneecaps on 1 knee? Anatomic impossibility. So we got to correct it. And it's running through business rules to do all of that. And then it's taking something that's near and dear to your heart back when you were at AIM, which is all this unstructured data. It's locked up on paper. It's very valuable, but we can't report from that. So we're taking that data in, ingesting it, categorizing it with a taxonomy, and then publishing that back. So a surgeon can sit down with their supply chain executive and their finance executive and say, you're the low cost leader, John. Why don't you sit with your colleagues and show them what you're doing in your practice? Help everybody to be as tight as you are. You're getting patients out quickly. The blood loss is low, but your implant spend is very, very low compared to everybody else. So these types of analytics have eluded surgeons and finance operators in hospitals for years because this data is not being collected. It's locked away in a piece of paper. So it's the compliance piece. We're correcting that bill, making sure that the data we're using and looking at is correct. It's collaboration because it takes supply chain who buys the implants, physician who uses them, and finance who doesn't even know if they're profitable in these cases at the hospital, to come together at the table with one pristine set of data. And right now, there are walls created between those individuals, ostensibly by the sales reps who kind of run interference, but take the surgeon to go play golf and a nice steak dinner at the Oasis, and then we'll go over here and we'll deal with supply chain, but we'll do a lot of techno speak and keep them confused. And the two don't get a chance to talk because they speak a different language. So we're coming in the middle of that, producing that collaboration, the compliance piece of the bill, and then we're using analytics to kind of tell the story and bring it all together for them.
So it seems like the language piece is germane to every industry out there. Usually every industry has some sort of unique taxonomies and metadata associated with how they do business in their particular industry. And I imagine this is certainly the case in the medical business, in the healthcare business. Do you see applicability of this in other businesses that have that, information friction, information, dichotomies that exist in there?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked lately a lot more, and mostly by investors who want to put some money in the business. We're saying, you've built a really cool engine, seems to be working very, very well in healthcare. What else can you apply it to?
Yeah.
I think there are some big problems still in healthcare that we are not touching. I think to use what we've built in pharmaceuticals would be fascinating, because for many years, pharmaceuticals had exactly the same problem that implants face today, which is a lack of transparency about how surgeons are being influenced or how physicians are being influenced. I remember I mentioned my dad was a cardiologist. I ran his front office for him for a period of time. That was before I moved to Maryland, when I lived in California. And I remember we would close the office at noon, and that was my dad's time to take his lunch. And I'd be up front doing billing, eating lunch. He'd be in the back, maybe dictating records and eating lunch. But there was always a knock at the door around 12:15, like clockwork. And I'd get up, I'd answer the door. It was a pharmaceutical rep. They knew they could get a hold of my dad because he wasn't seeing patients.
Right.
And about 3 months later, we'd end up in Maui or Puerto Vallarta or somewhere on a vacation, and he'd have to leave for lunch. And I'd always say to him, "Why do you always have to leave?" And he says, "How do you think we're taking this vacation?" And so he'd go to the pharmaceutical meeting.
Yep.
So, I think there's some applicability in bringing a lot of transparency to that, but also we call this asymmetrical. There's actually a name for it. Some professor came up with a name for this kind of asymmetrical buying thing, where you have a surgeon gets to choose, but a hospital has to pay, and never the two shall meet. Kind of this weird thing that goes on. So I think wherever you find that kind of a thing, I think this process works really well. It's kind of what I was doing in shipping too, by kind of demystifying how the pricing works. Why did I think I was going to pay $12 for this shipment? But by the time it got to the residential surcharge and the Saturday delivery and the signature at the door, it's $40. And you just can't build a business around that if you can't predict what your costs are going to be.
Yeah, that question, that I really like that idea that information asymmetry basically leads to pricing gaps that people can tap into, and it's not necessarily to the advantage of the people that are suffering through the information asymmetries. So,
Right.
So as you created this company, and you think about my shtick about oxymorons and pragmatary visionaries and pragmatic strategists and all that stuff. What kinds of experiences really stretched you when you were doing that, when you set up this company? Stretched your oxymoron kind of skills?
I really fit that bill well, because I think I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I mean, some of the stuff you just reminded me about back at AIM, where we set up this technology room. I might have alienated a lot of our staff, our other staff.
They were jealous. They were jealous, Rich.
They were jealous. Yeah. But we had, it was a .com kind of a style thing. Like we had that kind of a thing going on. So I like to think about those kinds of things. I like to create, but I'm more of a operator. Like I can get lost in a spreadsheet for hours. That's okay with me. So I was probably a pretty good fit for, VP of technology at AIM. But when it comes to being very visionary and looking forward and not having a competitor in the marketplace, that was really challenging, John. We didn't know, we had nobody to fence against, so no foil out there. So we were just pioneering, staying only one step ahead of our customers the whole time, hoping they wouldn't catch up with us and say, "You guys don't know what you're doing, do you?" And we're figuring it out as we go. But I had very, very good customers. Anne Arundel Medical Center in particular, who said to us, "You're welcome to create this company and this product in our midst. We'll alpha test it with you, even we'll beta test it with you." So very fortunate to have that. But I think having the vision to be able to push the thing forward, but knowing there's a fog bank out there, and knowing that when we get there, we'll see a little bit further and a little bit further, and having the discipline to just stick with that, even though it felt like it was a little scary and there was some unknowns there. That was a challenge for me. And then I think the second thing was really building a team. I managed a smaller team when I was working with you. I think we had about 8 people in that group, very talented technology folks. This team is up to 27, and
Wow.
I'm finding that I can't go at my speed. Like if I want to go fast, I go alone. But if I want to go further, I've got to take everybody with me.
Yep.
And to be able to slow down and explain things to people just because it's clear in my head doesn't mean it is to the team. And all of those things that probably you've experienced being in that seat as well.
Yeah, that question is really that. I hear what you're saying about that notion of creating value in a white space and defining value in a white space. You know, it's kind of like when Steve Jobs, introduced the iPhone originally. It was like, well, who the heck would want this thing?
Yeah,
And
right.
and so that's really hard, I think, because on the other hand, you still have to have the operational capability in order to execute against that vision, but nobody's really bought into the vision yet. So you got to spend some time defining what that's about. And
Nobody's purchased the iPhone because it didn't exist. So what the
yeah,
heck do we charge for the thing?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What is that the most challenging aspect of running Kermit, or what is the most challenging aspect?
I mean, I think the growth all along has been challenging because there are different things you have to pay attention to at different stages, and whether you're going to do this with investors' money or do it on your own and all of that. But right now, if you ask me right now, I would say customer acquisition is the most challenging thing. COVID shut us out of our client locations. We couldn't go to
Yeah,
ground zero and meet with them. Now, an interesting thing happened too is we're actually able to get more meetings than we did before because they're more apt to do it over Zoom because they're sitting in their house and they give you the time of day. Um, However, I think the other side of this is it's very hard to get anybody in a hospital to make a decision these days. They're worried that like I said, they're posting operating losses. They're doing far more with way less people. There's been this mass. If you've watched the Great Resignation, it's been
yeah,
the tip of the spear has been in our hospitals where they're really suffering right now, and they're hiring back the people that have left as contract workers, paying them 2 to 3 times what they were getting when they were salaried. So everything is very upside down. Um, that's been hard. And then I'd say probably, you know, to be direct with you, pricing the product has been a challenge because we've got this notion where we get paid out of savings, and a lot of people like that. They say, "I like the risk-based part of it. I'm in. You're not going to bill me unless you save money." And then there are a whole bunch of people on at least 50% that we meet who say, "I don't know. I don't know about that. Like, I need to know exactly what I'm going to pay."
yeah, yeah.
And I don't want it to be a blank checkbook. And I'm like, well, if I bring you a sack of cash and I scoop a little bit off the top, are you okay keeping the bag? And it's a weird thing for people to get their head around. The software can be purchased as a subscription. And so again, we don't have anybody who competes with us. This is a brand new product. And so, what's that worth? We've tried a couple of different pricing models, but none of them scale very elegantly when you start to get into very large health systems, when you charge on a per hospital or a per anything, and you're dealing with something like Ascension Health with 150 hospitals, all of a sudden the price gets crazy. So trying to figure that out so we can kind of scale at market has been tough.
Yeah, that pricing question is a real interesting one. I ran into that. I did this book, Immigrant Secrets, a little while ago, and I recently did the audio version of it. And as you would guess, with Audible and with Amazon, there's a whole network of people they've acquired along the way to make it an incredibly seamless experience. But there was a decision point you had to make along the way, which is, do you want to contract with somebody in exchange for a share of the revenues that this will generate, or do you want to pay them up front? And so, of course, you're always going to choose the pay them up front option if you think you're going to have the next bestseller in the world. But
Right.
probably the most rational thing is to do the other one, given that there's such a long tail to the publishing industry. But those pricing questions are just always so fascinating. But tell me a little bit about it. Maybe one last question. It can't have always been smooth sailing. How do you deal with the question of failures along the way?
Um, I'm a weird mix of kind of like very conservative, but maybe I don't mind taking risks. I'll say it this way: risk taking is not odd to me or uncomfortable when I'm betting on myself. I know that if I disappoint myself, I can pick myself back up and get back out there. What's been more difficult is when you have 26, 27 people and you go down payroll and you know the name of every single person and you know their family and their situation. And when COVID hit, John, we we had this interesting model where we only get paid based on savings.
Yeah.
So hospitals have to be doing surgery in order to save anything, and that's how we generate our invoices. So we were okay sending people home around March. And we said, surely hospitals won't close their operating rooms. And then like late March, April came, and yes, that's exactly what they were doing. And by June, we were watching horrific images from TV of bodies being loaded into refrigerated trucks. I mean, it was like ground zero. Nobody was going back there, and it still hasn't really come back fully to the volume that we'd seen prior to the pandemic. So I said we let the staff go home, and I said, here's what we need to do. We need to go back and be resourceful and look at everything we've invented. And let's try to repurpose. I felt like we were trying to get the Apollo 11 astronauts home. Like we dumped everything on the table and tried to like make different products out of what we built. And, but one thing I did pledge to the staff with my executive team, my partners and my executive team is if we can avoid it, nobody's getting fired. Nobody's getting laid off. And I had just hired maybe about 2 months ago, I had hired a guy from shock trauma, very, very talented guy. He'd been at the hospital at University of Maryland for 20 years, maybe. So this is his first office job. And the pandemic hits and he's packing his stuff up, like literally into a box. And I said, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I was last in, I'm first out, right? I said, absolutely not. Everybody's important. We don't have depth on our team to lose even one person. Every single team member is really important. So I'm proud to say, John, we managed to keep everybody. We got a little PPP money. It wasn't very much, but we managed to keep everybody. And we weathered that storm. And then, year and a half, 2 years later, hospital started doing surgery again. That's woke us up to a big hole in our model that we have to solve. So I think that's probably has been the biggest challenge of recent times.
Well, I tell you, it's really been a blast talking to you. I think one of the things that I find when you're kind of on this end of a career is to look and see the cool things that people that have worked with you and for you have done along the way. Mm-hmm. And it's so gratifying and exciting to see people go off and do terrific things. And you're one of them. So thank you for being with me today. And it's been a blast. Let's not make it 15 years next time.
Okay, deal. Thanks, John.
Take care, Rich.
All right.